I never thought silence could scream, but for 7 years, mine did. Every night, I heard it echo through the walls, the silence between me and my father. It was heavier than anger, louder than arguments. We hadn't spoken since the day I told him I didn't need him. He said the same, and that was it. Two stubborn hearts choosing pride over peace. Life moved on, at least that's what I told myself. I built a career, I smiled at people, I even prayed. But some prayers don't leave the ceiling when your heart is full of bitterness. I didn't realize that until the night God broke mine. It was around 2 a.m. when the memories started replaying. His disappointed eyes, my harsh words, the door slam that became the final punctuation of our story. I tried to distract myself, but something stronger pressed against my chest. A voice, not loud, but unmistakable. "Son, you can't move forward until you turn back." I froze. My hands shook. Tears came like floodwater. I argued with that voice, said it was too late, too broken. But the more I resisted, the gentler it became. "You asked me for restoration. This is where it begins." That night I fell to my knees for the first time in years, not out of guilt, but surrender. And when I picked up the phone to text my father, I didn't know if he'd respond. But I knew God already had. This story isn't just about a son and a father. It's about what happens when pride meets grace, and when silence becomes a battlefield that only love can win. You might see yourself somewhere in these words, maybe as the one who hurt, or the one still waiting for healing. When you finish reading, I want you to pause and comment. What lesson did this story teach you? Because sometimes, your reflection becomes the bridge that helps someone else find peace, forgiveness, and the courage to start again. I used to confuse quiet with peace. Quiet is what you buy when you close a door. Peace is what God gives when a door opens you. I learned that difference the hard way, over 7 long years in which my father and I let a single argument harden into a landscape, cliffs of pride, dry riverbeds where love once ran, canyons of things unsaid. We lived in the same city, under the same weather, but we inhabited different seasons. If it rained on his street, I didn't know. If the sun landed on my window, he didn't see. When people asked, "How's your dad?" I'd shrug and say, "We're not close," as if closeness were an optional feature you pay extra for. The truth was sharper. We weren't speaking. The fight itself wasn't cinematic. No plates thrown, no thunder crack, no neighbors at the door. It was the kind of day you forget until you realize the day never forgot you. We stood on opposite sides of the counter at the warehouse office, stacks of invoices between us like sandbags. He was insisting on a decision. I was insisting on being heard. Money and methods were the visible topic. Honor and identity were the invisible ones. He used a sentence with the word immature in it. I used one with controlling. And then I used another one, hotter, uglier. The kind of sentence that scorches on the way out and brands both of you. He flinched like I'd slapped him, and he replied with a silence that said I had. He turned, set his jaw, and signed a paper that turned my stake in the family business into an exit. I signed too, because the version of me standing there would rather lose equity than admit he wanted blessing. That evening I packed my desk into a cardboard box as if I were packing a decade into a shoebox and calling it thrift. He stayed in the office long after I left. The next morning there was no apology, no follow-up. The next week there was no call. The next month there was a birthday, his, and I convinced myself staying silent was giving space. The space learned my name and paid my rent. Silence doesn't begin as a wall. It begins as a hallway. You step into it to cool off, to compose yourself, to make a point. You tell yourself you'll walk back through when the other person also steps. Then days pass, then holidays, and the hallway locks from the outside. You learn to decorate it. You hang new achievements like pictures. You make playlists for walking laps in bitterness, tracks with titles like What I Should Have Said and How He Should Have Known. Quiet becomes your diet. Pride becomes your multivitamin, And every prayer you pray hits the ceiling and drips back down like condensation of your own breath. I kept attending church, because muscle memory is its own liturgy, but I perfected the art of being unconvicted. I stood during worship and sang the low parts so my throat wouldn't tighten. When the pastor talked about forgiveness, I took notes about healthy boundaries, a phrase I was using as a shield. Forgiveness, he said one Sunday, isn't saying what you did was fine. It's saying, you don't get to own me anymore. I wrote that down and then underlined the parts about how reconciliation requires 2 repentant hearts. I circled the second requirement twice, as if to prove why nothing could be done. The sermon ended with a story about a son and a father, and a table and a robe and a ring. I left before the benediction. Too emotional, I said to no one. But the truth was simpler. Conviction had put a hand on my shoulder, and I shook it off like a fly. Life offered distractions dressed as progress, a promotion, a new apartment with a window that learned how to gather morning, a gym membership I used mostly for the steam room because fog felt kinder than clarity. I learned to make a pasta sauce my friends complimented and accepted those compliments like they were proof of being okay. But late at night, when dishes dried and the playlist ran out, there was a weight in the room that my furniture couldn't lift. Memory has perfect night vision. It brought me scenes. My father holding a bicycle seat and letting go too early on purpose because he trusted my balance. My father at my high school game with a thermos of coffee, tapping the fence when my name was called. My father at graduation, tie crooked, smile straight. The montage never showed the fight. Memory is merciful that way. It lets you feel before you analyze. I would roll to my side to shut the scenes off and end up staring at a wall that looked too much like the one in my chest. Then came a Tuesday. That's how God seems to prefer to begin, with days that don't announce themselves. I was in the grocery store choosing tomatoes, performing the ritual of pretending I know which ones taste like summer. I heard a voice say my name the way only family friends say it, like it's a memory, not a sound. Mr. Pereira, a retired mechanic who used to tune our delivery trucks. He hugged me with the authority of a man who's hugged me since I was shorter than a spark plug. "How is your father?" he asked, like men of his generation ask questions in lobbies and parking lots that make you answer with more than the weather. We haven't talked, I said, aiming for light, landing on brittle. Mr. Pereira sighed, the kind that starts in the back and brings history with it. "He asks about you," he said, eyes doing the thing old men's eyes do when they want you to hear the sentence with your soul. He just won't admit it. I put tomatoes in a bag and carried home a truth heavier than groceries. Wanting to hear from someone and knowing they want to hear from you are not the same as courage. That night, I microwaved leftovers and ate standing up, the way people do when they're avoiding chairs because chairs invite thinking. I told myself I'd text my father on Sunday. Somehow Sunday felt safer, like reconciliation should wear a collared shirt. Then I turned on a documentary about estranged families reconciling, because sometimes we practice proximity with other people's stories before we walk into our own. An old man, white hair like surrender, held a photograph of his son and said, "If I could live again, I'd spend less time proving I was right and more time loving him." The sentence walked across my living room and sat down in front of me. I pressed pause and stared at a face I didn't know and recognized anyway. A whisper I didn't invite joined the room. "You still have time." I did what proud sons do. I argued with the air. "He could call too," I said. "He was harsh," I said. "He made me choose between honoring him and honoring myself," I said. The air did not argue back. It waited. Conviction has good posture. For a week, the world became a call and response. I'd ask for peace. I'd hear forgive. I'd read a psalm about deliverance. A footnote would link to mercy. I'd overhear a conversation at the cafe about repairing what you didn't break and breaking what you didn't repair. The pastor preached that Sunday from Matthew, and I tried to sit on the healthy boundary section again, but the text wouldn't let me. "Leave your gift at the altar," Jesus said, and first be reconciled to your brother. The sentence lifted my carefully arranged offering and set it aside like a waiter clearing plates for a course I hadn't ordered. First, be reconciled. The words were not a suggestion. They were a map. Maps still require feet. At 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday that felt like a held breath, I woke as if someone had said my name. The city outside my window was doing what cities do at that hour. Trash trucks declaring their purpose, one drunk laugh trying to be brave, a distant siren narrating someone else's emergency. Inside the room, a different siren sounded. Not panic, invitation. I put my feet on the floor because the ground is honest. I walked to the kitchen because light there is kinder. I filled a glass with water and tried to sip instead of gulp. Then I saw it on the fridge, the one photo I'd kept in a magnet so I wouldn't forget who we had been. Graduation day. My father's hand on my shoulders too squared, the sun doing that thing it does when it decides to bless your picture without being asked. The image had a small crease where my thumb always pressed when I adjusted the magnet. The crease looked like a fault line. Tears came not as drama, but as weather. I didn't summon them. They knew the route. I leaned my elbows on the counter and let my forehead rest on my hands and said the prayer that does more work than poetry. Help. When words returned, they were not brave. God, I don't know how to do this. I don't even know what this is. But if you're asking me to move first, then I need you to move me. Silence answered like company, the kind you don't rush to fill. Inside the quiet, a sentence formed, the way fog sometimes shapes letters if you stare long enough. You asked me for restoration. This is where it begins. I didn't feel ashamed, only seen. The difference between shame and conviction is the direction they point you. One points back into yourself until you disappear. The other points out toward mercy until you are found. I opened my phone, and my thumbs remembered how to shake. Pride suggested drafts. Love suggested truth. I wrote, Dad, I don't really know where to start. I'm sorry for my part in what happened. I miss you. I read it 3 times, hating every sentence that didn't carry the weight and fearing everyone that did. I added, if you don't want to respond, I'll understand. I just wanted to say I love you. Then I deleted the last line because it felt too raw. Then I put it back because raw is what honesty costs. My finger hovered above send like a diver above winter water. Then I pressed. The room did not change. The dishes in the rack were still a tower of apologies to future me. The humming in the wall remained the humming, but something in my chest unclenched like a hand told it could stop clinging. I set the phone face down because I wanted to pretend I didn't care. I set the phone face up because I wanted to catch the reply before it hit the table. I ended up holding it, which is what children do with talismans. Minutes became elastic. The 3 dots did not appear. Anxiety rehearsed catastrophes. Peace kept clearing its throat to sing. At 3:11 the screen lit, but not with text. A voice message notification. I opened it with the reverence of church doors. My father's voice came through thinner than I remembered and thicker with years. Son, he began, and the word undid me so completely that I had to pause and press the phone to my chest. I hit play again. Son, I don't know where to start either. I have a list of things I'm sorry for. I have a longer list of reasons I love you. I was wrong in the ways I pressed you. I was afraid in ways I didn't name. I miss you every day. A chair scraped in the background. He exhaled like a man who had carried a refrigerator down the stairs by himself, and finally set it down. If you want to talk, I'll answer. If you don't, I understand. Thank you for saying my name. I sat on the kitchen floor because sometimes humility means sitting lower than your pride. I replayed the message until the words stuck to the cabinets. I cried in the way bodies cry when they are tired of negotiating. Gratitude arrived not as fireworks, but as breathing that didn't have to ask permission. I said, thank you, to the ceiling, the floor, the God who wasn't located in either, and somehow held both. Morning brought evidence that the world had continued. Emails asking for deliverables. A calendar block reminding me of a meeting designed by someone who loves meetings. I replied to what required adulthood and left the rest for a slightly wiser version of me who would appear after coffee. Then I texted my father, "Can we talk tonight?" He replied with a time and a smile I could hear. The hours between that text and that call were a field I walked through with high grass brushing my knees. Pride tried to lead, then remembered it didn't know the way. Fear tried to measure scenarios, then got tired. At 8:02 p.m. I called. He answered on the first ring. We said hello like we were stepping into a cold lake together. Sharp intake, quick laugh, permission to proceed. We apologized in courses. We confessed in small bites so we wouldn't choke. We laughed at a story about the time he misread a road sign and drove us into a parade. He told me about a health scare the year before that turned out to be a false alarm, but not before it taught him which prayers come pre-memorized and which ones you have to write at 3 a.m. We didn't fix the past. We named it. Names shrink giants. Over the next week, we built a new rhythm. Short calls, long pauses that weren't threatening, texts with photos of things that mean, "I thought of you." A pair of boots at a shop window that looked like the pair he wore to my games. A sky over my building that looked like one we watched through a windshield when I was small and thought all sunsets belonged to our car. He sent a photo too. My graduation picture, edges frayed, his thumb in the frame like proof he had been holding it. When we agreed to meet, I cleaned my apartment because preparation is love in advance. I ironed a shirt because wrinkles felt like disrespect, though he's never minded them. I drove to his house like I was ferrying something sacred and breakable. The porch looked the same, which is to say older, which is to say faithful. He opened the door, and for a second we both measured the distance and saw it disappear. He stepped forward. I stepped forward. The hug was not polite or performative. It was a bridge discovering it still fit the riverbed. We sat at his kitchen table, the one where math homework had once turned into character formation, and pancake Saturdays had turned into my first lessons on generosity. He poured coffee the way he always had, too strong, and I added too much milk the way I always had, turning it the color of compromise. We talked until the talking turned into listening, until the listening turned into knowing. "I prayed for this," he said, and it didn't sound like a claim of credit. It sounded like gratitude assigned to its rightful address. "Me too," I said, and didn't bother to rank whose prayer mattered more, because the miracle had never asked for our math. Late that night, back in my apartment, I taped a verse to the mirror because I wanted my eyes to bump into it the next morning before they remembered my schedules. "He will restore the years that the locust has eaten." I have never seen a locust up close. I have seen years eaten by silence. I pressed the tape hard, the way you press a new truth into an old frame. In the glass, I saw my reflection softened by the text, and behind both, like another layer only a certain light reveals, the outline of a hand that had been steady the whole time. Peace is not something you purchase by closing doors. It is someone who walks through them and names the room. And I realized, quiet had been my idol. Peace had been my invitation. I had worshipped what I could control and ignored who could keep me. That night, I slept like houses sleep after storms, everything damp and safe, grateful to still be standing, grateful for gutters that did their job, grateful for builders who know how to angle roofs so water runs off and doesn't stay. When the alarm sounded, I did not negotiate with it. I stood, stretched, and whispered the most honest summary of the last 7 years and the last 7 days I could muster. Lord, thank you for breaking what was killing me and mending what I could not. Outside, pigeons practiced the daily liturgy of resurrection on the ledge, bobbing like small priests in gray robes. Inside, I practiced mine. Water on, verse in sight, phone ready not as a weapon, but as a bridge. The hallway I'd lived in was still there, but the door at the end stood open, light pooling on the floor like an answer I hadn't known the question for. I stepped through. I used to think God spoke only to the person who was praying. That night proved me wrong. It turns out he speaks in stereo, one voice moving across two rooms, two lives, until the same sentence arrives at both hearts at the exact right time. After I pressed send, I set my phone down, like you set down a fragile thing that might break if you breathe too hard. The screen went dark, but my apartment felt suddenly brighter, like someone had cracked a window in a house that had been shut for winter. I didn't pace. I didn't rehearse arguments or compose better versions of what I'd said. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to listen. Silence filled the room, but not the old kind. This silence didn't accuse, it attended. I could feel its patience, the way you feel sunlight even with your eyes closed. Warmth without words. I stood there in the kitchen with my hands flat on the counter and breathed in for 4, out for 7, as if my lungs needed to be convinced that peace is legal. The message notification blinked and my chest tightened. It wasn't text, it was audio. I stared for a long beat, as if eye contact would make me braver, then tapped play and held the phone like a sacrament. "Son," he began. The word struck me the way a name does when you haven't heard it in too long, like waking from a dream you wanted to keep. His voice was a little rougher, a little thinner, edges sanded by time, but it was unmistakably his. I sank to the floor without deciding to. He spoke haltingly, honestly, apologizing for the tone he used to carry like a shield, for the demands he mistook for love, for the pressure he mistook for preparation. He said he'd missed me every day and prayed in fits and starts that God would bring us back to each other. He said he didn't know where to start either, only that he wanted to. When the message ended, I didn't play it again right away. I pressed the phone to my chest and closed my eyes. I felt like a man who had stepped beneath a waterfall after years of thirst and didn't want to move for fear the water would realize its mistake and retract. When I finally did press play again, I noticed more. Small background noises that were their own narrations. A chair leg scraping tile, a breath held and released, the soft click of a ring tapping the table. Those details made it truer, not smaller. They told me where he was, at the kitchen table where we'd done math and pancakes and Saturdays. The geography of reconciliation had already begun. I texted a short reply because sometimes brevity is reverence. "Thank you. Can we talk tonight?" He answered almost immediately. "Yes. 8 p.m.? Even in pixels, his caution sounded like care. The hours between that message and our call moved like cattle across a road, steady, unhurried, forcing every driver to admit they are not in charge. At work, I read emails twice and answered once, unwilling to let a stray mood put thorns in someone else's day. I told a coworker I'd call him back and actually did. I ate lunch without my phone, watching leaves shiver in the parking lot and thinking how easily trees obey truth. When fear tried to do math, adding up old offenses, subtracting imagined intentions, I told it I no longer solved problems with pride's calculator. "We're using new numbers," I said out loud in my car, laughing at myself and liking who I sounded like. At 7:59, I sat on the edge of my couch and stared at the wall clock. At 8h, I hovered. At 8:01, I called. "Hello?" he answered on the first ring, the vowel round and careful. "Hey, Dad," I said. The last word slipped out before I could filter it. We both heard it land. We both let it stay. We began with the safest bridges, weather, work, how the neighbor still parks like he hates geometry. The laugh that followed came out of both of us at the same time and sounded like two ropes loosening in the same knot. Then we stepped toward the middle, where bridges always feel thinner. We talked about the day it broke. He told me what it looked like from his side. Paperwork he'd held like a tourniquet to stop a bleeding budget. Pride he'd mistaken for principle. Terror he'd named responsibility, because men are often taught to rename their fear bravery. I told him what it looked like from mine, words that felt like verdicts, a young man's chest suddenly full of bees, an urge to prove I wasn't a boy by leaving the way boys do. We didn't try to solve all the math at once. Confession happened in grams, not kilograms. We named what we could and let silence do the rest. There's a kind of quiet that sows. It moves back and forth until two torn edges accept each other again. Somewhere in that quiet, he said something that made the room blur. "I used to ask God to change you," he admitted. "Now I thank him he changed me first." I let the sentence sit like a guest of honor. "Me too," I said, and we both smiled at the grammar we now shared. We talked for an hour, then 90 minutes. We looped back to a memory of my graduation. The photo he still kept, the one I had on my fridge, 2 copies of the same joy. "I found it again the other night," he told me. "It fell out of a drawer and stared at me. I set it next to my Bible. I hadn't opened that Bible in months, maybe longer, but the picture made me open it. I don't know why. I landed in Luke, the prodigal. I closed it fast. Then your message came." We sat with that, each in our own room, both in the same story. Eventually, we picked a day to see each other. Saturday, noon, his house. Simple choices that felt like vows. Friday night, I barely slept, but not the old exhaustion. This was readiness. My body hummed like a wire strung between 2 light poles. Tense, yes, but also waiting for light to run. I ironed a shirt I didn't need to iron and cleaned my car as if tidiness could atone. I drove to his house like a careful courier. The porch looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe my heart looked bigger. He was already at the door, trying to act casual about what was not casual at all. For one breath, we looked like a photograph of 2 men posed in acceptance. For the next breath, we were not posed at all. He reached. I reached. The hug that followed was not delicate. It was right. It lasted long enough for the ribs to relearn whom they could trust. We didn't rush inside. We stood on the threshold, the way people do when they know they are changing rooms and want to honor both. Then we went to the kitchen table. Because of course we did. He poured coffee. I put too much milk. Our hands remembered their old choreography and found new courtesy. We sat. "I'm sorry," he said. Not a preface, not a closing, the whole sentence. He didn't explain it. He let it do its work. "I forgive you," I said. I had worried those words would taste like defeat. They tasted like bread. I added, "I'm sorry too." And he nodded as if I had just told him his own name, and he loved hearing it. We traced the 7 years with our fingertips, not pressing too hard where the skin was still thin. He told me about the year he thought he was sick, and how even when the doctor called to say it was nothing serious, he kept praying because he realized prayer wasn't a swap meet for diagnoses. It was a language for dependence. He told me about the Sunday he sat in the back of church and left before the last song, because he didn't want to be seen crying and because the last song was The Prodigal, and he wasn't ready. I told him about the day Mr. Pereira ambushed my heart in the tomato aisle. He laughed so suddenly we both startled, then we both laughed because startling each other with joy felt new and right. Before I left, he opened a drawer and pulled out a photograph wrapped in tissue. The graduation picture, edges softened by thumbs. "This belongs with you," he said. "God began something with it on my table. He can keep finishing it on yours." I slid it into my jacket pocket as if I were pocketing a relic. The fabric warmed around it like acceptance. The weeks that followed did not float in haloed perfection. Sometimes we misstepped. Sometimes we told old stories and found a splinter we hadn't removed. Sometimes we were too careful, our sentences walking like toddlers along the edge of the couch. But we also learned that care is not the enemy of courage. It is its tutor. We practiced calling each other first, not after I have perfected my apology. We practiced ending calls with, "I love you," not because we suddenly felt cinematic, but because truth belongs at the end of sentences like a period. He started going to church again, not to impress me, to answer someone else. He asked me once if I wanted to join him. I hesitated, wary of making our mended bridge carry too much weight too soon. Not today, I said, then added, soon. He didn't flinch. Soon is a good word, he said, and somehow it felt like grace given a calendar. One evening we were sitting on his porch, the light doing that golden hour trick where everything looks forgiven. He cleared his throat. I've been praying about something, he said. I smiled. I like this new sentence, I told him. He rolled his eyes in that way that fathers pretend to be annoyed when they're proud and continued. I want to make amends concretely, not just to you. He gestured toward the street, toward the city, toward people we couldn't see. I want to help other fathers and sons who got lost in the same hallways we did. He told me about the idea he'd been sketching. Small grants for family businesses that needed a second chance. Mentorship circles pairing older shop owners with younger ones. A quiet fund for emergency rent when a bad month threatened a good man's dignity. I don't want it to be my name, he said. I want it to be a bridge. I leaned back and let the word do its work. The Bridge Project, I said, and we both knew we had just named more than a program. We had named a promise. We started small because small is honest. We met on Tuesday nights with a handful of owners in a borrowed back room of a bakery that smelled like mercy and cinnamon. We drank coffee that the baker insisted was on the house and talked about invoices and inventories, yes, but also about fear and fathers and the pressure men put on their own chests. We opened in prayer, not eloquent, just true. We closed with action, 2 numbers to call, 1 person to text, 1 confession we'd say out loud to someone we trusted that week. Word spread the way good rumors do, quietly, accurately, landing in the right ears at the right time. By the 2nd month, there were too many chairs and never enough Kleenex. I watched my father in those rooms and met a version of him I had not known. He still carried authority, but it had been baptized in gentleness. He asked questions that didn't corner. He told stories where he was the one who needed grace. He loved to quote a line he'd underlined so hard in his new Bible that the paper thinned. "Your gentleness has made me great." He'd say it and press his palm flat on the table, like he was smoothing the words into the wood for the next group. Not every story in the Bridge Project ended in hugs. Sometimes reconciliation meant a letter and a boundary and a prayer sent into a house that wasn't ready for it yet. Sometimes help looked like a spreadsheet. Sometimes it looked like an anonymous envelope. Sometimes it looked like my father standing in a doorway with a bag of groceries, refusing to take a photo, refusing to be thanked. We learned the hard and holy distinction between fixing and keeping. Fixing is proud. Keeping is patient. God had kept us. We would keep others. One night, after a session where 3 grown men cried like they were finally allowed to be sons, my father called me close to midnight. "Can you come by?" he asked, his voice soft around the edges. I drove over, worried in the way sons worry, rehearsing how to be strong if strength was what the evening would require. He was fine. Tired, yes, eyes rimmed with the work of tenderness, but fine. We sat on the couch in the living room, lamps low, the night wrapped around the house like a shawl. "I was reading," he said, tapping the Bible with the corner of his finger. "Luke 15 again. I used to think that story was about the boy who left and the boy who stayed. I'm seeing the father now." He swallowed. "I'm seeing how he ran, how he didn't wait for explanations, how he put a robe on his smell and a ring on his shame." His eyes glistened. "I wish I had run sooner." He looked at me, and I saw in his face both the father who had once been too tired to run and the one now limber with mercy. "Thank you for making it easy to run." I reached for his hand the way toddlers do when they're telling you who they trust. "You ran," I said. "We both did. Or maybe," I smiled, "maybe we were carried." We sat there a long time, saying almost nothing, hearing almost everything. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked like punctuation. Somewhere in heaven, I imagined a party that hadn't stopped since the first message was sent. Not long after, He had a week where the old fatigue came back and brought a friend. Tests, appointments, the antiseptic choreography of medical buildings. He told me only what I needed to know, and I learned to ask better questions. What do you want for dinner? Sometimes means, how scared are you? Can I drive? Sometimes means, let me be your son. We sat in parking lots and didn't make promises to timelines we did not control. He said something one afternoon, looking out the windshield at a tree taking autumn seriously. If my healing looks like being made whole on the inside while my outside slows down, I'll take it. I nodded and decided to trust that sentence until someone with a lab coat told me I couldn't. He stayed steady mostly. He grew softer, always. One morning he texted me at 3:11, the same time his first voice note arrived. Awake praying. You were my first prayer tonight. Keep him, Lord. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned, then replied with the only phrase big enough for how small I felt. Amen. We marked the 1-year anniversary of that first message quietly. No balloons. A meal at the table where the photo had once leaned against a closed Bible. Now the Bible was open. The photo stood framed behind it, and a small candle burned like a witness. We took turns naming the mercies we could count and the ones we couldn't. We laughed when our lists overlapped, like we were telling the same story from two angles, and delighted in the confirmation. Before I left, he handed me a folded card. Inside was a simple line, written in his tidy print. Bridges don't build themselves. Thank you for picking up the first plank. I tapped the words with my finger the way he tapped verses. We'll keep building, I said. He nodded, and the nod meant more than agreement. It meant legacy. Driving home, the city lights looked like an alphabet I was finally learning to read. Every red blinking radio tower spelled patience. Every porch light spelled welcome. Every neon diner sign promised breakfast to someone who needed it. I rolled down the window and let November air do that crisp thing it does to cheeks and memory. I whispered, "Thank you," and meant it for the God who had taught me the difference between quiet and peace, between being right and being reconciled, between fixing and keeping. When I reached my apartment, I stood a minute at the mirror and saw the man I had become staring back at me, older by a year, lighter by a decade. The verse was still taped. The corners had started to curl again. I pressed them down. "Stay," I told the paper and the promise. My phone buzzed on the counter. A message from a number I didn't recognize. "Hi. I got your contact from the bridge project. My dad and I haven't spoken in 6 years. Do you think... Is it too late?" I texted back before fear could consult its watch. "It's not too late. Would you like help with the first message?" 3 dots appeared immediately. "Yes, please." Stereo. God speaking in 2 rooms again. 1 voice, 2 hearts. The exact right time. I used to think miracles happened like lightning. 1 bright strike, everything changed. Sometimes they do. But other times, miracles arrive like dawn, minute by minute, shadow by shadow, until you look around and realize you've been standing in the light for a while. That's how it felt in the months after my father and I said our first hello again. We didn't become best friends in a weekend. We didn't solve 7 years in 7 days. We learned each other the way rivers learn their banks, slowly, kindly, with new curves that didn't exist before. We began with small liturgies. He would text me photos of the sky at strange hours, and I would reply with a voice note saying what the colors felt like. We traded recipes we both mangled. We sent music we each thought the other might secretly need. I learned he'd started taking a different street home because the shortcut passed the place where we'd had our worst argument. He learned I kept the graduation photo near my front door so I would touch it on the way out without meaning to and remember who we are. Some Wednesdays I joined him at church and stood beside him during worship. We didn't sing the same harmonies, we didn't have to. One Sunday, the reading was Luke 15 again. In the pew, he squeezed my shoulder, just once, just enough. And I realized God loves to run that story on a loop because Reconciling Hearts is his favorite rerun. After the service, my father said, "I used to hear myself in the older brother. Now I hear the father's feet." He smiled, embarrassed by his own poetry. "I'm not saying I'm God," he added quickly. "I'm saying I finally learned to run." The next week, he asked if I would meet him at the warehouse, the old office we had once shared like a battlefield. The metal door groaned, as it always had, that familiar sound that used to feel like duty and now felt like history. Dust lay across the counter like time's handwriting. On the desk, papers, a notebook, a legal pad with a list written in my father's tidy block letters. He cleared his throat. "I've been praying about amends," he said, "not just with you." He gestured toward the emptiness that used to be inventory and now looked like possibility. With the city, with the boys who grew up without good men showing them how to be strong and kind at the same time. He slid the legal pad toward me. At the top, the Bridge Project. Under it, small grants, mentors, quiet grocery money, a phone number that answers, Tuesday nights, prayer first. "I don't want it to be about my name," he said. "I want it to be a bridge between men who forgot how to talk and sons who forgot how to try. Between pride and peace. Between I can do this alone and I was never meant to. Will you help me?" He swallowed. "As a partner, not an apprentice, not a competitor." I stared at the word bridge until the letters blurred. Then I nodded. "Let's start with coffee in a room," I said. "God will bring the rest." We borrowed the back room of a bakery that smelled like cinnamon and forgiveness. The owner, Marta, had known us since I was small and had seen both our tempers at full speed. She set out a carafe and said, "House rule. Refills are mercy." We laughed, as if we believed we were worthy of such easy grace. The first Tuesday night, 6 men came. 2 owned shops. One was a foreman. One had a side hustle and a side ache from pretending he was fine. 2 were sons, trying not to be their fathers and failing. My father opened with prayer, half breath, half plea. Then we talked about ledgers and lights bills, and why a simple handshake used to be enough, and why it still can be if your word is as good as your invoice. But we also talked about fathers, how they teach silence without meaning to, how they teach shouting without meaning to, how they teach absence without meaning to. I watched my father learn the discipline of asking a question and letting it hover. I watched men cry without apology, and then wipe their faces with the backs of their work hands and say, "All right then, what do we do next?" We built a rhythm. Every week we offer 3 kinds of help: bread, numbers, presence. Bread, because stomachs can't hear hope if they're arguing with hunger. Numbers, because sometimes a spreadsheet is where confession starts. Presence, because you can't outrun a night that knows your address, but it loses power if someone sits in it with you. Word spread the way mercy does, through the mouths of people who thought they had nothing to say. We made a small form for grants. What do you need? What will you change? Who will you thank when it works? We created a mentor list. Older owners willing to answer a question at 10 p.m. without adding shame to the invoice. We started a quiet fund called Porch Light. No photos, no speeches, just envelopes that found their way into mail slots with a prayer tucked inside. Lord, keep them. Then came the stories. Diego, a barber with wrists that could fade a line so clean you'd swear it was light, confessed he hadn't called his father in 9 years. He wrote a message at our table, voice shaking, as he read it into his phone. His father replied with a photo of a haircut Diego had given him when he was 12, a buzz cut full of love and mistakes. They met a week later. The following Tuesday, Diego brought his father to the bakery and gave him the first chair. We all applauded like it was a graduation. Anna, a seamstress, came on behalf of her brother, who had a small auto shop and a big debt to silence. She said, "He won't come, but I will sit here and learn so I can go home and be the bridge." My father stood and bowed to her as if she were a queen. Some bridges are daughters, he said. We printed a payment plan with numbers and grace in the margins. It fit her brother's month, like a well-made hem. João, who owned a market we used to deliver to, admitted he had yelled at his teenage son for breaking a crate of eggs when what he meant to say was, "I'm scared about money." He practiced the apology at our table. The next week, he brought his son, and the boy taught us how to build shelves on TikTok. We added skill swaps to the whiteboard and called it even. We didn't fix everybody. We weren't called to, but we kept everybody we could. We sat with men who had complicated stories and refused to let their worst chapter be their only one. We prayed with people who had forgotten the words and taught them a 3-syllable prayer that opens any locked room. Jesus, keep me. At home, my father changed in ways that looked like small renovations and felt like new construction. He called former employees he knew he'd been unfair to, not to defend himself, but to ask what repair would look like to them. He wrote letters with checks inside and no requirement to reply. He paid a vendor he'd haggled too hard and added a sticky note that said, "I'm sorry for teaching my son the wrong lesson that day." He showed me the carbon copies not as trophies, but as accountability. "If you ever see me slipping back into being right instead of being righteous," he said, "pull me by the sleeve." One night, he admitted a secret that didn't sound like a secret until it left his mouth. "I've been praying out loud." He laughed at himself. Turns out, hearing your own voice ask God for help is its own kind of repentance. He told me about the first time he did it, alone at his kitchen table with the photo of my graduation leaning against his reopened Bible. I said, "Father, teach me how to be one." He stared at the table as if the wood remembered, and he did. He is. We decided to hold a small gathering, nothing fancy, just testimonies, some music, and a chance for men to bring sons and sons to bring fathers. We rented the community center gym, rolled out a couple hundred folding chairs, and strung cafe lights because forgiveness deserves warm electricity. I made a slideshow of before and afters, not photos of people, but ledgers turned right side up, shop doors reopened, sticky notes with "I'm sorry" in familiar handwriting. At the end, we left the screen with only a sentence. One message, one prayer, one God who still speaks at 3 a.m. That night, everything felt tuned. Men who swore they'd never speak into a microphone stood and said, "I was wrong." Boys who swore they'd never cry in public wiped their faces on sleeves and didn't look ashamed. When it was my father's turn, he walked to the front with the careful steps of a man carrying something fragile and precious. He didn't preach. He testified. "I built a wall," he said, "and God built a bridge. I was an expert in being right. God taught me how to be kind. I thought silence was safety. God showed me it was a storm I was calling shelter. My son sent the first message, but make no mistake, God sent the invitation." He looked at me and smiled with eyes I recognized from a younger man. "If pride kept you alive, humility will let you live," he added, then laughed softly like he couldn't believe he'd said something worth writing down. We ended that night not with applause, but with prayer. We projected phone numbers for counseling and crisis lines on the wall like porch lights. We put index cards and pens on every chair and asked people to write 3 names. Who I am, when it's loud, who I call. We collected nothing. We asked nothing. We watched heaven do its math in real time. Sometime after midnight, I drove my father home. He was quiet in the passenger seat, a kind of quiet that hummed. When we reached his house, he stayed seated and looked out the window at the porch light leaking onto the steps. "I didn't think I'd live to see this," he said. Then he squeezed my hand the way you do when words would just spill over. "Thank you for sending the first message," he whispered. "Thank you for answering the first message," I said. It would be a perfect place to end the chapter, but God isn't a screenwriter aiming for symmetry. He's a father whose plot is mercy, and mercy keeps going. A winter later, fatigue began to loiter around my father. Not dramatic, just a shadow that returned even after a good night's sleep. He told me the doctor wanted tests. He told me not to worry. I worried the way sons do, which is to say, in sentences that begin with prayer and end with, "Keep him." We moved through weeks of waiting rooms with magazines nobody wanted, and TVs whispering cartoons to adults who couldn't bring themselves to care. In one clinic, a child waved at us from a stroller, and my father waved back like a grandpa who had always had that reflex. He was brave in the ways that bless nurses, on time, honest, kind about needles. He was brave in the ways that bless sons. He let me drive and didn't correct my parking. The news when it came wasn't catastrophic, but it wasn't nothing. Manageable, the doctor said, which is a word I've learned can hold both gratitude and grief without spilling either. My father took the results like he took most things now, head high, heart higher. If my body slows, he told me, maybe it's to match the pace my soul finally found. I can live with that. We adjusted. He rested more. I visited more. We kept Tuesdays sacred. We trained 2 more mentors to lead groups so the project didn't lean too hard on one man's energy. He wrote letters to his own body like David writes psalms to his soul. "You've served me well. I will be tender with you now." There was a night, one of those nights you don't plan but remember forever, when he called at 3:11 a.m. I answered on the first ring, startled, adrenaline already halfway to the door. His voice was steady. "I'm okay," he said quickly. I woke up praying and couldn't go back to sleep without telling you the sentence God put on my tongue." He cleared his throat. "Number 6, the Lord bless you and keep you." His voice softened. "It says keep like a promise, son. For years I tried to keep us with rules and grit. Turns out we were always kept by a person." I lay there in the dark, phone warm against my ear, and cried very quietly so he wouldn't hear. "Amen," I said, "and thank you." Spring arrived that year like a person who brings soup and doesn't ask how you're doing until you've finished the bowl. We held our second bridge night at the gym, twice the chairs, same lights, more stories than time. A man who had sworn his father's name was a curse said it like a blessing and promised to visit on Sunday. A girl in her 20s stood to thank the Tuesday uncles for teaching her to change the oil on her courage. My father stood at the back, hands in pockets, eyes wet. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The last time I saw him healthy week, not hospital week, we sat on his porch and watched neighbors walk dogs, pull trash cans, carry flowers. He told me he'd written something in case. He said he hoped I wouldn't need it for a long time. He gave me an envelope with my name on it in the careful script he used when he wanted his words to behave. "Read it when you need a father," he said. I told him I always did. He smiled. "Good," he replied. "Me too." Not long after, he went to sleep and kept sleeping. A morning nurse called. I drove. The house was quiet but not empty. His Bible was open to Psalm 23, the page worn soft. His glasses lay like punctuation on the nightstand. The photo of my graduation watched the room like a witness. I sat on the bed and let the cloth have my tears. I thanked God out loud that the last words between us were, "I love you." I thanked God that the years the locust had eaten had been fed back to us in double portions of meaning. At the funeral, the bakery closed early and brought trays no one remembered ordering. Men stood in borrowed suits next to sons in sneakers. Someone from the city said nice things. Someone from the Tuesday group told the truth. I told the story, the fight, the years, the message, the voice note, the porch, the project, the porch light, the God who still interrupts men at 3:11 a.m. Forgiveness didn't erase our past, I said into a microphone that did not deserve the honor. It redeemed it. My father's legacy is not that he was perfect. It's that he let God break him in the right places and rebuild him into a man whose strength finally looked like love. We buried him under a tree that takes its time. After everyone left, I stayed. I read the letter he had given me. It wasn't long. Fathers don't waste paper when they've learned to waste less pride. "Son, if you're reading this, I've gone where I can't be late anymore. I'm proud of you. Not for what you do, but for who you are becoming. If you ever doubt, return to 311. God meets men there. Keep building bridges, eat slow, forgive faster. If you miss me, that means love worked. I'll see you at the big table. Love, Dad. Grief did not end because I believed in heaven. It simply learned not to boss me. I cried at ridiculous hours over ordinary things. A man in a hardware store comparing screws. A father pushing a stroller past the bakery. A song my father hated because it repeated the same line too many times, and that I now loved for the repetition. But grief also taught me new prayers. Thank you for letting me have him, I'd say on good days. Keep me, I'd say on hard ones. Both were received. The bridge project didn't pause. It grew, not because of numbers on a chart, but because loss clarified purpose. We started a monthly workshop called Message One, where we helped people write the first text, the first letter, the first voice note. We kept an index card taped on the wall that said, short, true, kind. We practiced out loud. We rehearsed answers we might never get. We wrote blessings for ourselves in case none came back. We put a stack of stamped envelopes by the door and called it Courage to Go. A man once asked me if reconciliation always requires both parties. I told him the truth. Restored relationship, yes. Restored heart, no. God can heal your side even when the other side is still building its wall. Sometimes the first miracle is the weight that leaves your lungs when you forgive in a room by yourself. We added a quiet memorial at the bakery. A small frame with a verse my father had once underlined so hard the paper thinned. Your gentleness has made me great. And a simple line below it. Bridges don't build themselves. People put sticky notes around it with names they were praying for. Sons, fathers, mothers, daughters, bosses, themselves. On Tuesdays, before we started, we would stand in a circle and read them like a litany. When a story turned, someone would remove a note and keep it in their wallet until the ink wore off. Every so often I would catch a whiff of his cologne in the back room of the bakery. Nonsense, I know, but the heart keeps its own science. I'd close my eyes and say, "Thank you for letting him be a man who changed," and I'd add, "Make me one." On the anniversary of his passing, I stood at the gym where we hung cafe lights and told the newest group the oldest truth I know. God builds bridges where pride once built walls. A teenager with a hoodie pulled low lifted his head, just enough to let a tear roll out. An old man with a cane tapped the floor in agreement. A woman in the back wrote a name on an envelope and carried it out like communion. That night, after we stacked chairs and wiped tables and turned off the warm electricity, I walked outside and looked up. The sky had arranged itself into constellations I did not know the names of, and it didn't matter. I pulled out my phone and saw a message from a number I didn't recognize. "Hi, I got your contact from a friend. My son and I haven't spoken in 4 years. Do you think, is it too late?" My thumbs went to work without waiting for fear's permission. "It's not too late. Would you like help with the first message?" 3 dots appeared. "Please." Stereo again. 1 God, 2 rooms, perfect timing. I walked to my car with the slow certainty of someone who knows the difference between quiet and peace now. I sat, put my hands on the steering wheel, and prayed the blessing my father loved to say. "Lord, bless them and keep them. Send your face into the rooms where they are afraid to go. Teach their feet the way to the porch. Put the right words on their tongue, and give the other heart ears to hear. Build your bridge again." Then I drove home under a sky that keeps its appointments, past porches with lights that stay on for the late arrivals, carrying a small paper world in my pocket, a photograph with a crease where 2 thumbs once met, a letter that begins with son, and a list titled The Bridge Project that keeps adding names God refuses to forget. I taped a new card to my mirror that night. Who I am, when it's loud. Who I call. Under who I am, I wrote son. Under when it's loud, I wrote 311. Under who I call, I wrote Jesus and 2 friends who answer at any hour. The corners began to curl by morning. I pressed them down and whispered what my father used to say to verses and I now say to promises: stay.